Thank you, Dennis. My name is David G., and I am a grateful recovered alcoholic. I have a sobriety date in Alcoholics Anonymous of August 8th, 1994. And I'm also a sober member of Sexaholics Anonymous with a recovery date of October 1st of 2019. I'm very grateful to be here to be able to share experience, strength, and hope with the big book. If you were here last week, we covered up to Forward to the Second Edition.
Roman numeral 17.
XVII. I would just like to state the same thing that I did last week. I'm sorry. I do not speak for Alcoholics Anonymous or Sexaholics Anonymous as a whole. I don't claim to be an expert on anything, including the big book. I don't have any medical experience or any of that. I'm just someone who has found a way to recover through these 12 steps as they're laid out in our big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, we are in the history of AA being in the front of this book. After this week, we hope to move into the doctor's opinion, and then we hope to move into the other chapters as well, which will show us precisely how to recover. Now, there's always been a lot of doubt around that word, recover. As I stated last week, we don't ever want to get that word confused with cured. That's not what it's saying at all. But the book will precisely show us how to recover from a state of mind and insane thinking that continues to drive us back to drink and or act out all the time. I'm here to share my experience, not my ideas, not anyone else's, and that's just where we're at. We looked at the title page of the book that said this is the story of how many thousand men and women have recovered from alcoholism. We looked at the forward to the first edition, which told us there again. They were more than 100 men and women who had recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body, and to show others precisely how they had done that was the main purpose of the book. That is the main purpose of this book study over the weeks to come, is to lay out the instructions as it was given to the first 100 who recovered from a hopeless state of mind. We then begin to look at the forward to the second edition. We looked at the history of Alcoholics Anonymous and how it began. And the reason that we're looking at this in the front of the book is this is the mother of all fellowships. It always has been since the beginning. And so we want to take a good look at the history. I don't want to spend a lot of time there. I mean, the program of recovery is outlined later on in the book, and that's what we're hoping to get to. But without the history, I don't think it would make as much sense as it does with us taking a look at it here. Last week, we stopped at the bottom paragraph on
Roman numeral 17.
XVII. And at that time, we had talked about how Dr. Bob and Bill had met. We seen where Dr. Bob had been a member of the Oxford group, and he had repeatedly tried spiritual means to solve his dilemma. And if we look at our own lives, I'm sure that's happened for a lot of us. We've been to psychiatrists, I'm sure we've been to therapists, we've been to meetings, we've been to church, we've done all these things, and we end up relapsing over and over and over. That's my experience, the same as it was Dr. Bob. But it also says when Bill came to him and giving Dr. Silkworth's description of alcoholism and its hopelessness, which Dr. Bob did not know, the grave nature of step one is what changed that whole picture. And that's what we're hoping to do here. We're wanting to look at the grave nature of step one. We want to look at the solution, which is step two, and then the other 10 steps which keep us in that solution. And they are all laid out in the big book in the first 164 pages. So we're going to pick up this week at the bottom of
Roman numeral 17.
We've seen where they have just had a group conscience. Last full paragraph on that page talks about it was time that the struggling groups thought to place their message and unique experience before the world. And I'm just going to go ahead and pick up right there on a couple of sentences. This determination bore fruit in the spring of 1939 by the publication of this volume, not anything else other than this volume. And what had happened, Bill had went to Akron, Ohio, and I'm going to give a story here. Now, if I stop in the middle of the paragraph and I give a story about the history of this, and I come back to this paragraph and continue to read, some people feel that they may have missed something or I didn't cover it well enough. I'm just expounding on what this is in the history of it. What had happened, Bill had went to Akron, Ohio, on a business venture which had collapsed, and that's how he met Dr. Bob. That's a story that was last week on the recording. At this time, he's come back again on another business venture. And this time they sit down and they begin to count heads. And they had about 40 people in Akron and New York who had picked up this idea and who were staying sober and who was recovering from alcoholism. What they'd done was they had learned how to share the problem, the solution, and the program in action in order to recover. And that's what we want to do here in the weeks coming up. So they had sit down and counted about 40 people were now sober. And they realized that for the first time that they might have the answer for alcoholism. This is something that had never happened up to this time. Now they knew that they needed to get this information to as many alcoholics as possible. So their question was, how do we do this? And we feel that paragraph that we was just reading in was probably the first group conscience that was ever taken, because they called the people together there in Akron. They sit down, and for the first time they begin to discuss ideas of how they could place this message before the world. Now they came up with 3 ideas that night. One was that in those days it was almost unheard of for an alcoholic to go in and get detoxification. It was, in fact, a doctor had to lie and come up with some other condition other than alcoholism. They just would not treat them in those days. So one of the things that they come up with in that meeting that night is that they would build a chain of hospitals across the United States. And this would give every alcoholic the opportunity to detox. They felt like Dr. Bob would be the chief physician of that, and we are sure that he would be, because he was already a physician. Now, one of the other things that they talked about that night is that they would hire a group of missionaries and send them all over the U.S. carrying this message. We're quite sure that Bill Wilson would have probably wanted to lead that. However, the other thing that they talked about doing was writing down this information in a book. The Oxford group had many books that they had written that was successful, so they figured that they would write a book and that they would give the world a comprehensive picture of alcoholism and how to recover from it. Now, we know from history that when they left there that night, there was only one thing that came out of all of this. They didn't build the hospitals, and they didn't train the missionaries, and they didn't do any of that stuff. But they did write the book Alcoholics Anonymous. And with that, they would put down precisely how to recover from a hopeless state of mind and body. And that's going to lead us to the very bottom paragraph. And we're going to begin to see how the hand of God really starts to move in these pages because of the appearance of this book. Bottom paragraph, with the appearance of the new book, a great deal began to happen. Dr. Harry Emerson Fosdick, noted clergyman, reviewed it with approval in the fall of 1939. Fulton Osler, then called editor of Liberty, printed a piece in his magazines called Alcoholics and God. Now, once he done this, let's look what happened. This brought a rush of 800 frantic inquiries into the little New York office, which had meanwhile been established. Each inquiry was painstakingly answered. Pamphlets and books were sent out. Businessmen traveling out of existing groups were referred to these prospective newcomers. New groups started up, and it was found to the astonishment of everyone that AA's message could be transmitted in the mail as well as by the word of mouth. Now look at the result of this. From the appearance of this book, by the end of 1939, it was estimated that 800 alcoholics were on their way to recovery, and that was because of the book. It was the results of the book being written. 800 people were on their way to recovery. That's remarkable. That's amazing. Now, in the spring of 1940, this is just a few months later, John D. Rockefeller Jr. gave a dinner for many of his friends, which he invited AA members to tell their stories. News of this got out on the world wires. Inquiries have poured in again, and people went to the bookstores to get the book, Alcoholics Anonymous. By March of 1941, this is probably close to a year later, the membership had shot up to 2,000. 1,200 more people had recovered as a result of this book. Then Jack Alexander wrote a feature article in the Saturday Evening Post, which placed such a compelling picture of AA before the general public that alcoholics in need of help really deluged us. By the close of 41, now this is at the end of the year, AA numbered 8,000 members. My God, that's breathtaking to think that that many people could recover as a result of what was written down in this book. Now, if that can happen for them, that can most definitely happen for us. And what we want to do is we want to take the book and we want to do exactly what they did. We want to do exactly what they did to recover. We can recover also. The book promises that. It says our society then entered a fearsome and exciting adolescent period. The test it faced was this: could these large number of erstwhile erratic alcoholics successfully meet and work together? Would there be quarrels over membership, leadership, and money? Would there be strivings for power and prestige? Would there be schisms which would set AA apart, split AA apart? Soon AA was beset by these very problems on every side and every group. But out of this first frightening and disturbing experience, the convictions grew. And I think this sentence applies to you and I as much as it did to those in those days. We either hang together or we die separately. And those are strong words, but I've found it definitely to be true. We either unify the fellowship or we pass off the scene. This is going to lead us into where they came up with the 12 traditions. We're going to take a look at that, and then we'll just continue to move on. As we discovered the principles by which the individual alcoholic could live, that was the 12 steps. So we had to involve the principles by which the AA groups and AA as a whole could survive and function effectively. That's the 12 traditions. It was thought that no alcoholic man or woman could be excluded from our society, that our leaders might serve but never govern. That each group was that was tradition 2, that our leaders might serve but never govern. That each group was to be autonomous, that's tradition 4, and that there was to be no professional class of therapy. Now, I've seen professional men come in and try to use AA in different fellowships and the book to grow their therapy, and I haven't seen very good results really ever come out of that. In fact, some of them have been pretty devastating what happened. There were to be no dues or fees. Our expenses was to be met by our own voluntary contribution. There was to be the least possible organization, even in our service centers. Our public relations was based upon attraction rather than promotion. That is tradition 11. It was decided that all members ought to be anonymous at the level of press, radio, TV, and films, and in no circumstances should we give endorsements, make alliances, or enter public controversies. He says, now this was the substance of AA's 12 traditions, which are stated in full on page 561 of this book. So if you want to take a closer look at those, that's where it's going to be. It's going to be on page 561 of this book. No, none of these principles had the force of rules or laws. They have become so widely accepted in 1950 that they were confirmed by the first international conference held at Cleveland. Today, the remarkable unity of AA, our fellowship in Alcoholics Anonymous, our fellowship in Sexaholics Anonymous, our fellowship in whatever anonymous that you're in, is just that. Look what it says. Today, the remarkable unity of AA is one of the greatest assets our society has. It's one of the greatest assets. It is not the greatest asset. While internal difficulties of our adolescent period was being ironed out, public acceptance of AA grew by leaps and bounds. For these, there were 2 principal reasons. Now, if there are 2 principal reasons, we're going to want to look at each one of those pretty closely. And one of the personal reasons is found in this next sentence: the large number of recovery and reunited homes. That's been my life and many of the lives of the men that I know. That's the first principal reason right there. These made their impression everywhere. Of alcoholics who came to AA and really tried, 50% got sober at once and remained that way. And we need to remember that in those days, the program and the fellowship was exactly the same. There was no difference in it. It wasn't until the 1980s when treatment centers began to come around, and I most definitely do not have anything against treatment centers. I sobered up in one, Alcoholics Anonymous. Thank God it was AA based, and it was sold on the 12 steps. But they began to bring all kinds of information in, and they started teaching it to people. And there was almost one on every street corner in those days. And slowly, the program and the fellowship began to change. See, the program and the fellowship had changed, but the program inside of the book has never changed. And I think that's what we get away from so many times is we'll start adding things either to the book or we'll start taking things away from the book. And the next thing you know, the message gets watered down, and there we are right back in the same boat that we were before. So I know with me, all the men that I work with, we are definitely through the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous in each of the steps. And we stick to it. When it says we pray, we pray. When it says we write, we write. When it says we don't, we don't. We stick to the letter of the book. And there's been some awesome, God is really, there's some success stories there. And a lot of them are on this call today. But the large number of recovery reunited homes, and there again, those that came and really tried, 50% got sober at once and remained that way. 25% sobered up after some relapses. Think about that in our own life, because for me, that's the category I would fit into. 25% that sobered up after some relapses. But among the remainder that stayed on with AA, they showed improvement. Now, I don't claim to be a mathematician or any of that, but I can tell you 75% is a pretty good number. I would dare to say what it is today in our fellowship. I can guarantee you it's nowhere close to 75% recovery rate. It's just not anywhere I've been anyway. Other thousands came to a few AA meetings and at first decided they didn't want the program. I think that word's important for us to remember. I hear a lot about my program and a program. This book's going to talk about the program. A great number of these, about 2 out of 3, begin to return as time passed. So another reason, it talked about 2 principal reasons. Up there we looked at one. Let's look at the second one. Another reason for the wide acceptance of AA was the ministration of friends in medicine, religion, and the press. Now I can tell you that I was an agnostic whenever I came here. Anything to do with a minister or anything about the word God really did not set well with me at all. I was very ugly about that. I treated people very nasty whenever they would talk about those things. But when Charlie began to take me through this book, that was one of the sentences that we hit on quite a bit. These people are our friends, David. There again, the wide acceptance of AA was the ministration of friends in medicine, friends in religion, and friends in the press, together with numerous others, became our able and persistent advocates. Without such support, AA could have made only the slowest progress. Some of the recommendations of AA's early medical and religious friends, there it is again, will be found further on in this book. Alcoholics Anonymous is not a religious organization. Thank God for that, because I don't believe I could have stayed here whenever I came. Neither does AA take any particular medical point of view, though we do cooperate widely with the men of medicine as well as the men of religion. Alcohol being no respecter of persons, we are in an accurate cross-section of America and distant lands. The same democratic evening up process now going on by religious affiliation. We include Catholics, Protestants, Jews, Hindus, and a sprinkling of Muslims and Buddhists. More than 15% of us are women. I love this here. Even in those days, look at that. At present, our membership is pyramiding at the rate of about 20% a year. So far up on the total problem of several million in actual potential alcoholics in the world, we've made only a scratch. In all probability, we shall never be able to touch more than a fair fraction of the alcohol problem and all its ramifications. Upon therapy for the alcoholic himself, we surely have no monopoly. I really have to stress that a lot with the guys that I work with in both fellowships. As far as therapy, I can't do that. I mean, I have a message to carry through the 12 steps as outlined in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, period. But look at the next sentence. Yet it is our great hope that all who have yet found no answer, and ask yourself that question today. If you're on this call and you've struggled with this over and over and over, and you've yet to find an answer, This next sentence may begin to tell you where to find it. It says that you may find one in the pages of this book, and those two words being the key words, the pages of this book, and will presently join us on a high road to a new freedom, and that is a promise. Moving over to forward to the third edition, and by March of 1976, we're looking at several years later now. This is the edition that I sobered up in Alcoholics Anonymous. There was no fourth edition whenever I came in and got sober. There was only the third. In fact, there was a lot of problems whenever the fourth edition come out. One of the books one of the stories in the back of the book was called "Acceptance Was the Answer," or Dr. Alcoholic Addict. And that story wasn't taken out, but it was moved around. But they had talked about taking that story out, and there were a lot of people really upset about that. But forward to the third edition reads this. By March of 1976, when this edition went to the printer, the total worldwide membership of Alcoholics Anonymous was conservatively estimated at more than 1 million, with almost 28,000 groups meeting in over 90 countries. That's a long way from two men sitting in a kitchen talking about, the program, and it's just amazing how this goes. Surveys of groups in the U.S. and Canada indicate that AA is reaching out. One of the questions I always ask myself, do I reach out? Do I reach out to others quite often? And I can happily say, yes, I do. Not only to more and more people, but to a wider and wider range. Women now make up more than 1/4 of the membership among newer members. The proportion is nearly 1/3. 7% of AA surveyed are less than 30 years of age, among them many in their teens. But here it is. The basic principles of the AA program, it appears, hold good for individuals with many different lifestyles, just as the program, not my program, the program has brought recovery to those of many different nationalities. The 12 steps that summarize the program may be called Los Dos Pesos in one country, we know that to be Mexico, Les Dulce Tapes in another, but they trace exactly the same path to recovery that was blazed by the earliest members of Alcoholics Anonymous. I worked in Odessa, Texas for a little while, and I found a place where I could go to a meeting. We had a young man come in, and he could not speak any English at all. And he knew he needed to be in the meetings, but he didn't know, he couldn't understand. And so I sat there and watched this guy for a couple of weeks. And, he was getting really frustrated that we were reading the book we were sharing, but he couldn't understand it. When I came back to Oklahoma on my days off, I went to Intergroup to get I sponsored a chip that I could present to him that evening. And I just happened to run across a big book that was written in Spanish. And I picked that big book up, and I took that back when I went back to Odessa, Texas. And when I went into that meeting, that man came in that night, and he was just you could just tell he was aggravated. And he sat down with his cup of coffee, and I walked over and I handed him that big book. And he looked at it, and he looked at me, and he looked at it again, and he began to read a little bit of it, and he could understand. And although we could not communicate because I didn't know his language and he didn't know mine, together we were able to show him at least where to go and what to read. And as far as I know, that man ended up getting sober. They did eventually get a translator come in that could talk to him and share the book Alcoholics Anonymous with him. And that was a beautiful experience right there. So bottom paragraph says this: in spite of the great increase in the size and the span of this fellowship, at its core it remains simple and personal. Each day, somewhere in the world, recovery begins when one alcoholic talks with another, sharing experience, strength, and hope. Now, I would have always told you that my recovery began when I woke up that morning and I said a prayer and I asked God to help me. I would have told you that my recovery began that day whenever I did meditation, as is outlined in the Big Book. And all of that stuff is necessary for the program of recovery that I experienced today. However, that sentence tells me recovery begins when one alcoholic talks with another, sharing his experience, strength, and hope. And I like to personalize that and take a look at that. I talk with many alcoholics, sexaholics, lustaholics, addicts throughout the day. My phone starts ringing at 3:30 a.m. Central Standard Time, and it doesn't quit until about 4 in the evening. So I have opportunity to share with a lot of addicts the program of recovery as outlined in the book, and it's a beautiful thing to be a part of. It really, really is. So with that being said, let's take a look at Forward to the 4th edition, and I'm hoping that we can finish that up this week and that we'll be ready to move into the doctor's opinion. There again, this has been the history of Alcoholics Anonymous. I know some of it is interesting, some of it is not. I understand that, I get that. But we will be moving into the program, and we'll be taking a look at physically what is wrong with us. And but if we leave this edition out, then it's just not going to work. So we're going to take a look at Forward to the 4th edition. This 4th edition of Alcoholics Anonymous came off the press in November of 2001 at the start of the new millennium. Since the 3rd edition was published in 1976, worldwide membership of AA had just about doubled and had to an estimated 2 million or more, with more than, God, look at that number, groups in approximately 150 countries around the world. And the last time I checked, this was in 2013, it was in 173 countries at that time. So here it is, 2020, and it's everywhere today. Now, literature has played a major role, and it's kind of been my experience for the ones especially that are recovering from this, literature, and especially this book, has been the only major role, really. I mean, I've seen guys come in, I've seen them sober up on the fellowship, and it seems to go good for a little while, but at some point it seems like the mind returns, and we believe the lie once more that we can either drink, we can act out, whatever it is we do, we buy into that lie, and we're gone again and again. And that's probably several people's experience that is here today. It says AA's growth and striking phenomenon of the past quarter century has been the explosion of translations of our basic literature into many language and dialects. In country after country where the AA seed was planted, it has taken root, slowly at first, and then growing by leaps and bounds. When literature has become available, currently, Alcoholics Anonymous has been translated into 43 languages. Man, what a miracle. I mean, it's just, the power of God is just all over that. So the message of recovery, and I like to look at that as outlined in this book, has reached larger number of peoples. It has also touched the lives of a vastly greater variety of suffering alcoholics. I like to look at that as a promise. When the phrase on page 17 in this book, where people who normally would not mix, was written in 1939, we got to remember it referred to a fellowship composed largely of men and a very few women with quite similar social, ethnic, and economic backgrounds. Like so much of AA's basic text, those words have proved to be far more visionary than the founding members could have ever imagined. Today, it's worldwide. It's everywhere. So the stories added to this edition represent a membership whose characteristics of age, gender, race, and culture have widened and have deepened to encompass virtually everyone the first 100 members could have hoped to reach. While literature has preserved the integrity of the AA message, and again, we're talking about this book, sweeping changes in society as a whole are reflected in new custom and practices within the fellowship, not the program, the fellowship. Taking advantage of technological advances, for example, AA members with computers can participate in meetings online, sharing with fellow alcoholics across the country and around the world. We wouldn't be here today if it was not for that. It's a beautiful way to be in recovery today. I thank God for this. It's made all the difference in the world for me. In any meeting, anywhere, AA share their experience, strength, and hope with each other in order to stay sober and help other alcoholics, modem to modem or face to face. AA speak the language of the heart in all its power and its simplicity. And that does cover the forewords in the history of Alcoholics Anonymous as we've looked at it. Okay, the doctor's opinion. In the late 1920s, our country went through a Great Depression. A lot of people lost a lot of money. The little man that wrote this chapter was one of those people. He was a doctor. He was also a psychiatrist and neurologist, and he had he's quite a man, as we're going to see as we begin to move through this chapter. Now, we did talk a little bit about him in the forewords. Here we're going to take a look at probably some of the most vital information I feel that has ever been written on alcoholism. He was offered a job at Towns Hospital by a man named Charlie Towns for, I think it was like $40 a week plus room and board. And what he did was he began to see people like you and I come in and out, in and out, in and out. Now, when you look at that as far as the alcoholic, when he come in, they would give him the best medical treatment that was known to that day. They would sober him up. They would bring him down. They would put him in a room. They would give him everything that they could give him. And then he would be released back out into the streets. Now, what this little guy did was he began to recognize that while they were in there, once they got the alcohol out of their system, they seemed to be okay. But whenever they went out, there was something in their mind that told them that it would be okay for them to drink again. And my experience as a sexaholic, it would tell me it would be okay for me to act out again. I would believe that lie. I would act based on that information that my mind gave me. And what he calls the phenomenon of craving would develop, and this would happen over and over and over. In fact, we're going to look closely at his story here, and we're going to see if we can pick a little bit of information out of here that may be good for us to apply into our lives today. He says, we of Alcoholics Anonymous believe that the reader, and that took me a few readings to realize that was talking about me, the reader, I'm a little slower than most, will be interested in the medical estimate of the plan of recovery. Now look where he says it's going to be described in the book. Convincing testimony must surely come from medical men who have had experience, not knowledge, not just knowledge, but experience with the suffering of our members, and look at this promise, and has witnessed our return to health. What a beautiful promise. A well-known doctor, chief physician at a nationally prominent hospital specializing in alcoholic and drug addiction, gave Alcoholics Anonymous this letter. Now, in those days, if you wanted to go to somewhere to do a 12-step call, where it'd be a clinic, it could be a hospital, something like, you could not do that. You had to have a letter that was signed by a medical doctor. And this is the man who gave Alcoholics Anonymous this letter. This is the first letter that we're going to be taking a look at. Now look what he says, to whom it may concern. I put my name above that because today that concerns me. Now look at this one word, I. In other words, he doesn't have anyone backing him up at this point. He says, this is my opinion. He says, I have specialized in the treatment of alcoholism for many years. In late 1934, I attended a patient who, though he had been a competent businessman of good earning capacity, was an alcoholic of a type I'd come to regard as hopeless. Now, the man he was talking about here was obviously Bill Wilson. Now, in those days, whenever he would bring you into his hospital, he would sober you up, he would get you over the DTs, he would begin to feed you, you'd start to get your health back, he would send you back out. If you showed up at least 3 times in those days, at that point, he regarded you as hopeless. You were sent to upstate New York, and you was never to come back. You would go to a wet brain clinic, and that would be the end of it. And so Bill, at this point, was on his way, because as he said right there, he was an alcoholic of a type I had come to regard as hopeless. But in the course of Bill's third treatment, he acquired certain ideas concerning a possible means of recovery. As part of his rehabilitation, he commenced to present his conception to other alcoholics. But remember, it says as part of his rehabilitation. It's not the only part. It's part of it. We know that we have to have the fellowship today. We know that we have to have the program today. And there's more than just one part. Impressing upon them that they must do likewise with still others. This has become the basis of a rapidly growing fellowship of these men and their families. Look at this promise. And this promise pertains to you and me just as much as it did to them in those days. This man and over 100 others appear to have recovered. Not recovering, recovered. He said, I personally know scores of cases with whom were of the type with whom other methods had failed completely. Let me look at that in my own experience. I have been baptized, I've been prayed over, I've been dunked, I've been smudged by Native Americans. I've sat in Native American sweat lodge. I've done all of these things. I've tried all these other methods, and they have completely failed. I mean, not that I didn't get some kind of experience from that, because I did, but I didn't recover. In fact, it was the same way with lust. I found myself going over and over and over to those Native American sweat lodges, and it would bring me relief temporarily, but it would always return, and I would always act out once more. Bottom paragraph, he said these facts. Well, what are these facts? One of them is right up there at the top full paragraph, where he said, this man was an alcoholic of a type I'd become to regard as hopeless. People like you and me that relapse over and over and over and over with this, we appear to be hopeless. The other is the certain ideas contain an impossible means of recovery. And the last is like, once we get this message, we're going to have to share that with other people no matter what, if we want to hold on to it. Next page. The physician, who at our request gave us this letter, has been kind enough to enlarge upon his views in another statement which follows. In this statement, he confirms what we who have suffered alcoholic torture must believe. And as a sexaholic, it's the same thing. I must believe what he's fixing to tell me here. If I don't believe this, there's no point in me going on any further in the book, because anything he tells me here after this, I must be convinced of this. Otherwise, it's not going to be a part of my experience. Look at what he says. He says the body of the alcoholic is quite as abnormal as his mind. Now, I don't need to read a book, and I don't need to talk to a doctor for anybody to tell me that I'm abnormal in my mind. I know that already when I get here. I'm convinced of that. But if you tell me that my body is as sick as my mind, that's a statement that's going to be hard for me to believe. That's going to be hard for me to understand. But look at the statement, what he said. In this statement, he confirms what we who have suffered alcoholic torture must believe, that the body of the alcoholic is quite as abnormal as his mind. It did not satisfy us to be told that we could not control our drinking, or in my case as a sexaholic, to control my lusting and acting out. Just because I was maladjusted to life, in full flight from reality, or outright mental defect. Now, these things were true to some extent. In fact, to a considerable extent with some of us. But this next word is going to change the whole context of this paragraph. But we are sure that our bodies are sickened as well. And if I'm not sure of that, there's no point in me moving on any further. And he's going to go into pretty great detail of this, and we're going to give good examples to show exactly what he's talking about. And I guarantee you we can identify with most of these if we are the alcoholic, the sexaholic, whatever aholic we are, as this book is going to lay it out. I have a daughter that lives about 90 miles from here, and everything he described in that upper part of the paragraph, she is. She's a maladjusted to life. There are times when she's in full flight from reality, outright mental defect, all of those things. But the difference between me and her is anytime she puts alcohol into her body, that's enough. It doesn't take very much of it, and she doesn't want any more. Now, you take the same scenario, same story with me. Once I put it in, I can't stop. I had an ex-wife. We could buy a six-pack of beer. She'd drink 3. I'd drink 3. It may be 6 months before she drank any more. It'd be 6 months before I quit. Why is that? He goes on to explain this as an allergy. Same way as a sexaholic. I can fight lust within my mind, and I can fight it, and I can fight it. I've taken the lust drink, and I'm fighting it, and I'm trying to keep from acting out. But as soon as I do, it's almost like there's a craving that comes over me that demands more of the same. And we're going to look more in depth at this as we go on in the next week or so. We're going to look at some examples laid out in the first step and the next few chapters following after that. It's going to set it up for us to have a program of recovery in order to recover here. So if you're serious about recovery, not just staying sober, we know how to stay sober. Just don't drink. Just don't act out. We know how to stay sober. But if once you stop doing that, the insanity returns, and that drives you absolutely crazy until you do it again, then you've met the true nature of the problem. And that's what we're going to be looking at moving forward. I know we're out of time, Dennis. We can pick up right there next week. So I'm going to go ahead and close it there, hand it back to you.